I bet you think shit was happy in the 50s, huh? Well, it wasn't. Literally nobody was happy. Literally nobody had cars or barbecues. Everybody was doing drugs and running around being covertly gay and molesting each other. Yuck, yuck, yuck. I am so sick of this goddamn trope. Hey kids, Larson Halleck here with a discussion of a trope, I guess, or a cultural stereotype. Namely, it's the idea that is basically ubiquitous amongst leftists that the 50s, or really any time before 1964, but the 50s in particular, were this howling wilderness of evil and barely suppressed vice and human darkness. This leftist meme from the Twitter account of the same name basically sums it up. Nope, nobody was happy. Literally nobody had any fun in the time period. Everybody was taking Valium and barbiturates. Everybody was secretly gay. No women got educations. And the whole time period desperately needed the liberation of soft drugs and anonymous sex. Derp. Okay, let's make something perfectly clear here. I'm not an idiot. I'm well aware that the 50s were hardly a utopia. No time period was. And contrary to popular belief, the mainstream media of the day was more than willing to talk about the issues of the day. Bill Mauldin's political cartoons made very clear the rise of post-war juvenile delinquency, bigotry, and the Red Scare. You can watch Razor Fist videos on Hollywood to see why I roll my eyes at that. Movies like Rebel Without a Cause and Bigger Than Life similarly addressed familial dysfunction in the overall zeitgeist, and we can throw in the entire genre of film noir into the post-war malaise as well. With all that being said, let's point out a few things. One is that the oft-mocked cliches of the 1950s, the, pipe-smoking, smiling, patriarchal douchebag and all that, most of those were found in sitcoms. Situational comedies, i.e. shows that are supposed to be light and pleasant. Like, what the hell are you expecting out of a network sitcom? And if that cliche isn't in a sitcom, it's probably in some doofy PSA shown to school children, such as the hilarious A Date with Your Family. The point I'm trying to make is that this cliche was never some rigidly enforced edict from the government to force society to be a certain way. It was being propagated, yes, but it was being deconstructed literally at the exact same time. Secondly, does nobody else find it a bit hypocritical that these people accuse anybody who compliments any aspect of the decade of being too influenced by media and advertisements, and yet their entire conception of the decade seems to come from satirical movies that were made 30 years after the fact? In other words, that their entire image of the decade was formed by movies purporting to expose the dark underbelly of the 50s, and thus their image is just as, curated by the media? Or for that matter, does nobody else find it a bit hypocritical that the same people who say this stuff are the same people who say that World War II soldiers were the original Antifa? So, the brave Antifa soldiers came home from World War II, and then they immediately established a fascist hell on earth of patriarchy and spousal abuse and deeply closeted homosexuality. Yeah, no, that doesn't seem to add up. To reiterate, I'm well aware that no decade is perfect, but I do have to ask, looking at it from a 2021 perspective, was the American mid-century really that bad? I don't think so. In fact, I can think of quite a few things that were objectively better than today. Let's start with one that the lefties would agree with me on. Economic protections, and yes, a social safety net. Almost half the country's labor force was unionized. Tariffs and protectionism kept wages high, and yes, there was substantial wage growth for the jobby. The wage gap between the capitalist class and the worker class was much lower then than it is today. While there was no socialized medicine per se, womb-to-tomb employment would almost always provide health insurance, so there was easily available healthcare for those who had jobs that provided it. And guess how much it costs to get a college education? To cite one example, a little bit later on in time, my father's master's degree in the 1970s cost him about $8,000 total. Ditto housing, in that houses were affordable, and you didn't have multinational corporations buying up empty houses to instate feudalism in this country. What else is a big issue? I don't know, mental health? A common stereotype of the mid-century is that of mother's little helper. Women who were so crushed by their domestic burdens and the cult of domesticity that they had to slam barbiturates and Valium at all times to dull the pain. And by my research, there was indeed some amount of truth to this. 25% of women were in fact doing this. Well, that's no good. You know what else is bad, though? The fact that an even higher percentage of women today are taking drugs. Oh shit. How could that be? Are women today also being forced into the domestic sphere? Are you really gonna look me in the eye and tell me that? Yeah, that torch of women's liberation is being taken up by the flickering candle of embattled, every single corporation in the country. As a minor segue, can we all agree that if the federal government and every single corporation is on your side, you may not be oppressed. So yeah, women back then faced depression and turned to drugs to cope, certainly, but women today are facing even higher rates of depression and taking even more drugs. Once again, something's a little bit wrong with the narrative here. You know, I'm not a genius by any means, but I can notice a pattern here. Women were forced to be chased and discouraged from getting careers and such. They didn't like this and they turned to drugs to cope. That's bad. Women currently are encouraged to be wild, drunken, slovenly office jockeys who have promiscuous sex and openly mock women who have families. And yes, this is part of modern culture, don't even try to deny it. And how did women respond? By being even more depressed and taking even more drugs. Isn't that just as bad? I've said it before and I'll say it again. At least 25% of women in the world would be infinitely happier and fulfilled being housewives and mothers than doing meaningless corporate bullshit work. And probably the same amount of women, if not more, long for the benevolent, brill-creamed hand of patriarchy, emphasis on benevolent patriarchy, which, yes, does include helping with the housework and child-rearing and such, while still ultimately wearing the pants and taking charge. It should not be a revelation that we can find the middle ground between timid housefrows and drunken wine-aunts furiously grabbing every cock they see in a desperate attempt to give their lives meaning. Dressing well. This is a relatively minor thing in comparison to the first two, but boy do I hate how everybody dresses like an infant nowadays. Not to brag, but I've literally been told on many occasions that I look like Superman. Not the physique or the chiseled jawline, of course, but the hair. That's the power of the side part and ducktail pompadour, gentlemen. People are literally not used to seeing such a dapper haircut. No fatties. Yes, people, there was a magical time when the average American woman was 120 pounds and had a 27-inch waist. Remind me how fat our countrywomen are today? Oh, right. And again, this is basically encouraged. Where's her organs? Shut up. Not to let men off the hook. The average American man is 200 pounds nowadays, and that probably ain't muscle. Literature that didn't suck. Wow, look at all that not Faulkner and Bukowski and Burroughs that we have nowadays. Does anybody else miss when American literature was actually, good? Okay, so yeah, there's a few examples I pulled out of my ass right there. And again, obviously, not everything was good in the American mid-century. Polio and Jim Crow laws are not good, certainly. But to say it was all bad, that the entire decade was the whipping boy of history, is equally fallacious. Can we all agree that at least some things were better back in the day, and at least some things were lost? But now I must ask, why? 60 years after the fact, why do the leftists keep dredging this up? Why do they continue using pre-1960s America as a whipping boy? I have thought of a few reasons for this. The first is they are projecting their own neuroses into the past. The present sucks objectively, so you have to cut down the past so people don't ask why things are worse now than they were then. And much of our societal discourse is written by miserable people in bad health, bad relationships, both romantic and familial, who cannot conceive of anybody ever being happy, so obviously everybody in the past was just as miserable as they are today. Number 2, the great heroic myth of modern American liberalism, and Europe as well, I'm looking at you in the generation of 1968, France, is how they, the totally awesome and cool baby boomers, triumphed over the stodgy evilness of the dark before times. Anybody who grew up in the 80s or 90s, like myself, got a great heaping helping of this myth, and if you were to deconstruct this, like point out that the 50s were not quite as stodgy and evil as they appeared, or that much of the counterculture of the 60s and 70s was tied to the CIA, well then that would destroy the legitimacy of their entire worldview. They wouldn't be heroes anymore. They would be reduced to just a bunch of sloppy hedonists who destroyed societal cohesion and millennia of decorum for drugs and meaningless sex. This myth of modern liberalism that I just discussed may or may not dovetail into the fact that many of those curating the narrative are out-and-out communists, and by some astonishing coincidence, destroying and demonizing past seems to happen in basically every communist country. Number 3, this is an immigrant conqueror's mythology to demonize the past of the old people so they look better. This is something I notice a lot with people of color. They recognize the winds of change are coming and America will soon no longer have a clear white majority. Whether or not this is a good or bad thing is irrelevant. It is happening. Oh yes, it's also the same reason that POCs that used to be considered white are now fighting desperately to not be white, as I said in my last video about white privilege. And something else you will notice throughout history, whenever there is a massive Volkerwanderung, There tends to be these what I call conqueror mythologies that all justify why the old people were bad and they deserve to have their lands and stuff taken from them. Countless examples can be found throughout history. Manifest Destiny, the White Man's Burden, the International Communist Revolution, Lebensraum, the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, and so on and so forth. The constant demonization of the American past, and constantly digging up more and more, let's be honest, petty grievances against people of color, is just that. A way to say, the old people were bad, we are coming in now, you deserve to be displaced. Look how the narrative of immigration in not just America, but in all Western countries, has changed from immigration is good to immigration is your punishment. Number 4. Genuine ignorance. In many cases, it is just genuine ignorance. This is the narrative that has been pushed for more than half a century, and a lot of the young kids, they just don't know any better. I put myself as somebody who bought into the narrative when he was a lad, and only detoxed myself over many years of independent reading and study. And of course, number 5. Fuck you, Dad! Like so many other things I've discussed, much of modern pathology can be traced back to somebody being angry and resentful towards their father. Daddy issues cause no end of problems. And yeah, that about sums it up. A lot of the jokes are funny. I mean, I still laugh my ass off when I watch the Mystery Science Theater 3000 version of A Date with Your Family. But seriously, this trope needs to die. I'm Larson Halleck, reminding you to take your nation's history, warts and all, the good and the bad. And now, a word from our sponsors. Hello, are you a fan of Larson Halleck and the Barbaric Gentleman? Of course you are, otherwise you wouldn't be watching. Would you like to help the channel grow? Here's how you can. You can go to patreon.com and pledge some money, joining the ranks of the illustrious heroes you'll find at the end of the video. You can also go to paypal.me/LarsonHalleck to give me some money, or you can follow me on social media, at Larson Halleck on Twitter and Instagram. I don't use right-wing grifter sites like Gab and Parler because they suck. You can also buy my books. The links to do so are in the video description. And of course, please subscribe and spread the word. That name again is Larson Halleck, and I hope you enjoyed the video.